I heard her before I saw her. A small sound at the bakery door. The kind that could have been wind or a cat or nothing. The city made all kinds of sounds at 5 in the morning, but something in it made me put down the bench scraper and wipe my hands on my apron. I had been working for an hour already, the first 2 loaves cooling on the rack, the seeded batch proving under a damp cloth. The street outside was dark and empty and cold in the way that early autumn mornings in this city were cold, not winter cold, just the reminder that winter was coming. I opened the door. She was standing on the step. 4 years old, maybe. Small, even for 4. She was wearing a nightdress, cream-colored, fine cotton, the kind of nightdress that cost more than I charged for a week of bread, and her feet were bare on the pavement. There was a small cut on her left knee, dried blood. Her eyes, when she looked up at me, were dark and very careful, the eyes of someone who had been frightened and had come through the other side of frightened into a state that was quieter and more wary. She looked at me. I looked at her. I said, "Are you hungry?" She considered this for a moment. Then she nodded. I opened the door wider and stepped back. She came inside. I did not ask her how she had gotten there, or where she had come from, or who she belonged to. These were questions for later. The immediate situation was a 4-year-old with bare feet on cold pavement and a cut knee, and the hollow-cheeked look of someone who had not eaten in longer than a child should go without eating. The questions could wait until those facts were addressed. I set her at the counter on the high stool. She was small enough that her feet didn't reach the footrest. She sat very straight to compensate and put warm bread and honey in front of her. She looked at the bread, then at me, then at the bread again. She picked it up with both hands and ate it with the focused intensity of someone conducting important work. I went back to the bench. The seeded loaves needed checking. The oven temperature wanted adjusting. These were the tasks of the morning, and the morning was not going to pause because a child had appeared on my step, so I moved through them with the kind of deliberate ordinaries that I had learned, in 4 years of running this bakery alone, was the best thing to offer someone who had recently been through something. The scent reached me while I was checking the oven. Not her scent she smelled of cold air and the city and something faintly floral from the soap of wherever she had come from. Underneath it, deeper, the way a structural element was deeper than the surface material, dark cedar and smoke. Alpha lineage, strong enough to read clearly. Not one alpha, a pack signature, the layered complexity of multiple alphas whose scent had overlapped and merged over years. I noted this the way I noted structural things, factually, without editorializing. This child belonged to someone powerful. That was a problem for later. The immediate problem was that she had finished the first piece of bread and was looking at the honey pot with an expression of careful restraint that suggested she wanted more but had been taught not to ask. I put another slice in front of her. Her restraint dissolved. She ate it faster than the first. I found the small first aid tin I kept under the counter, knelt beside the stool, and looked at the cut on her knee. It was shallow, clean enough, not infected. She watched me clean it with the patient stillness of a child who had decided to trust the person doing the cleaning, which was a different quality from the stillness of a child who was simply too tired to protest. When I was done, she said, without preamble, "Thank you." Her voice was low for a 4-year-old, considered. I said, "You're welcome. I'm Rudy." She thought about this. She said, "Aaron." I said, "Do you know where you live, Aaron?" She looked at the counter. She was quiet for a moment. Then she shook her head, and I could see that the head shake was not dishonesty, it was the honest answer of a child who knew home but did not have the words for it that would mean something to a stranger. I said, "Okay, you can stay here until we figure it out." I found a pair of clean socks in the drawer where I kept the things I had accumulated for no specific reason but had kept because they were useful. A spare apron, a roll of twine, a flashlight, 2 pairs of socks. I crouched down and put the socks on her feet. She looked at me while I did it with an expression I could not fully read but that landed somewhere in my chest and stayed there. I straightened up. I put a stack of paper napkins on the counter and a pen beside them. She looked at the napkins. Her hand went to the pen immediately. She drew. She drew the way children drew, who had been drawing their whole lives, not self-consciously, not for performance, but with the focused, private purpose of someone working something out on paper. I could see the shapes emerging as I moved back and forth behind the counter. Something four-legged. Something with ears. Wolves. I put the third batch of loaves in the oven, turned the radio on low so the bakery had sound without being demanding, and started on the morning's orders. The first customer arrived at 6:30, the elderly beta from the building across the street who came every morning for the same 2 rolls and always paid an exact change. He looked at Aaron on the stool. Aaron looked at him. He said to me, while collecting his rolls, "Yours?" I said, "Visiting." He nodded with the serene incuriosity of a man in his 80s who had seen most things and found very few of them genuinely surprising, and left. Aaron watched him go. She slid her latest drawing across the counter toward me without comment. A wolf, careful ears, 4 paws, sitting in front of something that was either a building or a box. Precise, for a 4-year-old. The proportions were considered. I put it on the wall behind the register with a piece of tape. She looked at where I had put it. Then she picked up the pen and started a new one. I worked the morning service with Aaron at the counter, drawing, eating a third piece of bread when I put it in front of her, occasionally watching the door with the alert watchfulness of someone who had been trained to notice exits. She did not speak much. I did not require her to. Silence in a bakery was not unfriendly silence, it was just the sound of work being done, which was a kind of company all its own. Around mid-morning, when the rush had thinned, I leaned on the counter across from her. I said, "Your dads will be looking for you." It was not a question. She put down the pen. She looked at the drawing she had been working on another wolf, this one with something held in its mouth, a smaller shape, not threatening, just carrying. She said, "Romy breaks things when he's scared." I looked at her. I said, "How many dads do you have, Aaron?" She held up 3 fingers. 3 fingers. Dark cedar and smoke. A nightdress that cost more than my weekly groceries. A child who knew how to sit still and wait and had been taught, by someone, the discipline of not asking for things, even when she wanted them. I looked at the 3 fingers and I thought about the Voss name. Everyone in this city knew the Voss name the way everyone knew which streets to avoid after dark and which buildings had different rules from the ones posted outside them. The Voss triplets ran the Eastern District was a polite word for it, but it was the word people used. 3 of them, identical in the way that triplets were identical on the outside and entirely distinct on the inside, which everyone who had ever encountered them quickly understood. You did not confuse Cairo Voss for Romy Voss if you had met both. The difference was not in their faces. I looked at Aaron. I thought, this explains the scent. I thought, this changes several things about the situation. I thought, it does not change what I do next, which is continue feeding this child until I can verify she is going back somewhere safe. She had picked the pen back up. The wolf carrying something had gained detail. The smaller shape in its mouth had ears now, was clearly a smaller wolf, a pup. I watched her draw and thought about 3 Mafia bosses losing their minds for 72 hours, and I thought about what it meant that she had walked for God knows how long and ended up on my step, and I thought that the reason did not matter as much as the fact of it. She was here. She was fed. Her knee was clean. I would figure out the rest. I tried the obvious routes first. Not the police precinct. A 4-year-old with a Voss pack scent being brought to the attention of the police department was not a favor to anyone, including Aaron, but the neighborhood network, the informal channels that every district in this city had if you knew where to pull. I put out the word quietly. Child found, young, no injury beyond a minor cut, looking for family. The word came back, nothing. No one had heard of a missing child. No one was asking. This meant the Voss family was looking through their own channels, which was what I had expected. It also meant they had not yet found those channels leading to my street, which gave me time. Time for what? I was still working out. Aaron stayed. The storage room above the bakery had technically been a storage room since I moved in 3 years ago, which meant it had boxes in it that I moved in an afternoon to make space for the narrow daybed I had been meaning to assemble since I bought it 8 months ago. I assembled it. I found a spare blanket in the closet. I put the illustrated wolf book that my neighbor Mrs. Petrov had brought over. She had materialized at my counter the second morning, with it tucked under her arm, and set it down without comment, which was the Mrs. Petrov way of doing most things beside the daybed. Aaron slept well, better than I expected for a child in a strange place, but the quality of a child's sleep told you things. And what Erin's sleep told me was that she had been more frightened of wherever she had been than of wherever she currently was. She woke at 4 in the morning the first night, sat straight up, very still, listening, the way a person listened when they were checking whether the world had changed while they slept. I was already awake, the way I was always awake before 4, and I came and sat on the floor near the daybed and talked about what I was going to bake in the morning, what the weather was going to do, what the neighborhood sounded like at this hour. She listened. After a while, she lay back down. She did this all 3 nights. I talked her through all 3 of them. During the days she lived at the counter, my regulars absorbed her with the easy acceptance of people who had been coming to the same bakery long enough to trust the judgment of the person behind the counter. Jerome, the night shift nurse, brought a small stuffed rabbit on the second morning, setting it on the counter in front of Erin without fanfare, which she received with the grave politeness of someone accepting a significant gift. The university students in the afternoon brought colored pens. She organized the pens by color before she used them, which told me something about how her mind worked. She drew constantly. Wolves, mostly, but also buildings' large angular structures with many windows that looked architectural rather than childish, drawn with more precision than most 4-year-olds managed. I kept everything she finished. The wall behind the register was becoming a gallery. On the second afternoon, I asked her about her dad's. Not a direct question I did not want to press, but I set a plate of the seeded bread in front of her and said, while doing something else with my hands, "Tell me about Romy." She thought about it. She said, "He's the biggest one. He has a scar here." She touched her own jaw. "He doesn't talk much, but when he talks, it means something." She considered. "He taught me to tie my shoes, but it took a long time because his fingers are big." She ate a piece of bread. "And the other 2? Fisher does the money," she said. "He explains things to me like I'm going to understand all of it." She seemed to find this acceptable rather than condescending. "He gets me books." He read me all of one about wolves and there were pictures. She glanced at the book on the counter. "Not like this one. Photographs." "In Cairo?" "Cairo thinks a lot," she said simply. "You can see it happening. He looks at things for a long time before he decides." She picked up a green pen and began drawing. I thought about what she had described 3 men in sharp relief through the eyes of a child who loved them, and I thought about the compound on the eastern edge of the city and what 3 days of not knowing must feel like if you were someone who ran everything and could not run this. On the 3rd day, the neighborhood network came back to me with something I had not looked for but received anyway. The Voss compound had been hit. Not a major assault, the word was. It had been a diversion, professional, targeted, the timing matched. I stood in my kitchen above the bakery and put the timeline together. Attack on the compound, chaos in the lockdown, a door left unlatched, a 4-year-old who decided the outside was better than what was happening inside. I went downstairs. Aaron was drawing at the counter. Today's drawing had both wolves and a building. The wolves were inside the building, which was new. I said, quietly, mostly to myself, "Your dads are probably losing their minds." She put the pen down. She said, "Will you call them?" "Yes," I said. "I'm going to call them." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Will you stay when they come?" I looked at her. I said, "I'll be right here." She picked the pen back up. She drew 2 more wolves into the building before I went to find the number. The call was short. I identified myself. I said I had the child. I said she was safe. I gave the address. There was a silence on the other end of approximately 3 seconds. I would later understand this as the sound of a very controlled man finding and reassembling his composure, and then Cairo Voss said, "We'll be there in 20 minutes." I said, "Take your time. She's eating." Another silence, briefer. He said, "Thank you." He did not wait for a response. The call ended. I went upstairs. I said to Erin, "They're coming." She looked at me with the dark, careful eyes that had been the first thing I had seen of her. She said, "I know." She picked up the stuffed rabbit Jerome had brought and held it against her chest. I said, "Do you want to go upstairs while I talk to them first?" She thought about this. She said, "Yes," and then, "I want a cinnamon roll." I said, "Done." I made the cinnamon roll before they arrived, which was the right order of priorities. They came in under 20 minutes, which meant they had already been searching in my district. 3 black vehicles stopped outside, 6 men in dark coats who stayed at the pavement at a gesture from the first man through the bakery door. The security apparatus of a major crime family deploying itself outside a small bakery on the western edge of the city was a particular kind of absurdity that I noted and set aside because the more pressing thing was the 3 men now standing in my shop. Cairo came in first. I had a picture in my head from what Aaron had told me and from what I knew of the Voss name. The picture was not wrong, but it was incomplete. Cairo Voss in person was controlled in the way that spoke of something being continuously managed beneath the surface, the exhaustion of a man who had been running on no sleep and contained fear for 3 days and was not going to let any of that show in his face while he was standing in a stranger's space. His eyes went around the room once, fast, systematic, and landed on me. He said, "Where is she?" It was not a question. It was the sound of a man who had been asking this question for 72 hours and was still asking it, was still in the mode of the asking even though the answer was already here. I said, "She's safe. She's upstairs. She's eaten, she slept, and the cut on her knee is clean." I paused. "I need to know she's safe with you before I bring her down." The room changed. Behind Cairo, Romy made a sound that was not a word. He was the one Aaron had described as the biggest, and she had not been wrong. He was 6 feet of a man who had not slept in 3 days, and whose particular way of processing fear appeared to involve a dangerous quantity of contained energy. He was looking at the door that led upstairs with the focused attention of someone who had decided where he was going and was currently being prevented. Fisher put a hand on Romy's arm. He was the one I placed last, the cold precision of his face, the way he was already assessing the situation in a way that was similar to Cairo's but differently angled, coming at things from the side rather than straight on. He looked at me. He said, "You're asking us to prove ourselves." I said, "She's 4 years old. She woke up at 4 in the morning for 3 nights and sat very still and listened for danger. I need to know she's going back somewhere safe." Fisher held my gaze. He said, "She does that at home, too." He said it the way people said things that hurt them plainly, without cushioning, because cushioning it would have been worse. The pain of a father who knew his daughter carried fear she should not have had to carry, and who had to live with the fact of it. It told me more than any answer designed to reassure me would have. I said, "Give me a moment." I went upstairs. Erin was sitting on the daybed with the cinnamon roll I had made her, the rabbit in her lap, the wolf book beside her. She looked at me when I came in. She said, "Are they all here?" I said, "All 3. She put the cinnamon roll down. She stood up. She smoothed the front of the nightdress, which was a gesture so adult and unconscious that it landed somewhere in my chest. She said, "Okay." She walked to the stairs. I followed her down. She appeared in the bakery doorway, small and serious, and holding the stuffed rabbit, and looked at the 3 men. Romy dropped to his knees before she reached him. She ran the last 3 steps. His arms went around her and she disappeared into them. She was so much smaller than he was that she simply vanished into the embrace, and the sound he made was not something I had expected from the man Aaron had described. Not loud, just the sound of something releasing that had been held at enormous pressure for a very long time. She was talking against his shoulder, small, murmured words, her hands gripping the back of his jacket. Cairo and Fisher were both completely still. I turned and went behind the counter because I needed something to do with my hands, and because this was not my moment, I started the coffee machine. I got 3 cups out. I heard, behind me, the sound of Fisher's voice, very low, saying something to Aaron that I did not try to make out. I heard Cairo exhale one breath, long and controlled, the exhale of someone standing down from 3 days of a particular kind of siege. I put the 3 cups on the counter. Fisher sat down. He sat down the way very large events sat people down, not a choice exactly, more a settling. He rested his arms on the counter and looked at the wall behind the register. At Aaron's drawings. He looked at them for a long time. I set coffee in front of him. He said, still looking at the drawings, "She did all of these?" I said, 3 days worth. He touched the edge of one, not taking it, just touching the corner of the paper. The wolf carrying the smaller wolf, his jaw moved once. He said, "Thank you." I said, "She liked the bread with the seeds. Keep that in mind." He looked at me then. The assessment in his eyes had shifted to something I did not have a clean category for yet. He said, "You kept her for 3 days." I said, "Someone had to." He said, "Most people in this city would have called us the moment they recognized the scent or gone the other direction." I said, "Most people are operating from fear. I wasn't scared of you. I was making sure she was safe." He held my gaze. He said, "She is. Safe with us." I said, "I can see that." Romy had moved to the stool at the end of the counter with Aaron still attached to him. She had migrated from being held to sitting beside him with her hand tucked in his, which was a different thing. The choice to maintain contact rather than require it. He was looking at the same drawing Fisher had touched. He reached out and put his finger on the small wolf in the larger wolf's mouth. He said to Aaron, "You drew this?" She said, "The big one is you. The small one is me." He looked at the drawing for a long time. He said very carefully, "Why is the big one carrying the small one?" She looked at him with the patient expression of someone explaining something obvious to someone she loved. She said, "Because that's what you do." Romy put his hand flat on the counter. He pressed it down hard for a moment, and then he let go. Cairo had taken the stool at the other end of the counter. He had his coffee in front of him, and he was looking at me with the expression I had identified when he first walked in, systematic, information gathering, but it had changed slightly. Something had been added to it that was less strategic. He said, "How did you know to wait before you called? Most people would have called immediately or not at all." I said, "I tried other routes first. If you had a missing child listed with police or public channels, I would have found it. You didn't. That meant you were searching privately, which meant involving police would create a problem you were already managing around. I tried to give you time to find her through your own channels first." He said, "For 3 days." I said, "Your channels didn't reach my street until today." A pause. He said, "Why didn't you just call when you recognized the scent?" I said, "Because recognizing a scent doesn't tell me whether a child is safe going back to the source of it. I needed to know something about you first." He said, "And now?" I looked at Romy, who was sitting very still while Aaron talked to him. I looked at Fisher, who was reading the labels on my bread carefully, with the focused attention of someone who was doing something with his hands because he needed something to do with his hands. I thought about what Aaron had said about each of them over 3 days, the specific, affectionate, unsentimental portrait of three fathers drawn by a child who knew them completely. I said, "Now I know something about you." Cairo held my gaze. He said, "She told you things." I said, "She told me everything." Something moved through his expression. He said, "What did she tell you about me?" I said, "That you think a lot, that you look at things for a long time before you decide, and that you're the one who figured out she could reach the high shelf if she stood on the third step of the library ladder, which she has been using to her advantage ever since." He was quiet for a moment. Then, for the first time since he had walked through my door, the controlled surface cracked slightly. He said, "She told you that?" I said, "She told me that with some satisfaction, yes." He looked at his coffee. The crack was still there, barely, but present the specific expression of a father who has been outmaneuvered by his 4-year-old and is privately glad about it. We stayed for another hour. Not planned, there was no agreement that they would stay, no invitation beyond the coffee already in front of them. But Aaron showed no inclination toward leaving, and the three of them were adjusting from 3 days of one mode into a different mode, and a bakery counter with coffee was apparently an acceptable place to do that. At some point, Erin climbed down from her stool and went to the chalkboard where I wrote the daily menu. She picked up the chalk. She drew a wolf on the corner of it, careful ears, 4 paws, and looked at me over her shoulder. I said, "Leave room for tomorrow's bread." She considered the available space and moved her wolf to a smaller corner. The 3 men at the counter watched this exchange. Fisher said quietly, to no one specifically, "She hasn't drawn on anything at home in 3 months." No one answered. The information sat in the room. I went back to the afternoon's bread. When they finally left Aaron between Romy and Fisher, Cairo, a step behind Aaron, stopped at the door and turned. She said, "I'll come back." I said, "The bread will be here." She looked at me for a moment with the dark, watchful eyes that had been the first thing I had seen of her, and the last. Then she went through the door. I stood at the counter in the quiet that followed and looked at the wall behind the register at 3 days of wolves and buildings and the wolf carrying the smaller wolf pinned at the center. I put the kettle on. I thought about what Fisher had said she hasn't drawn on anything at home in 3 months, and I thought about what it meant that she had drawn constantly here, and I thought about the cedar and smoke scent that was still in the bakery, still in the air, still doing the thing my omega biology had been registering for 3 days. I thought, they will come back. I thought, I am not sure what I am going to do about that. I poured my tea and went to start on the evening bread, and I noted, accurately and without deciding anything yet, that the bakery did not feel the way it usually felt after closing. It felt like something that had been opened. End of parts 1 through 3. They came back the next day. Not all 3 Cairo, alone, with Aaron and 2 security personnel who waited outside as if this were a standard arrangement. He sat at the end stool, ordered coffee, and watched me work with the systematic attention of a man who had decided that observing something carefully was the appropriate first step before doing anything else with it. I put coffee in front of him. I went back to the morning's orders. Erin climbed onto her usual stool, the second from the left, which had become her stool over 3 days in a way that furniture sometimes became specific to specific people, and reached for the pen she had left there yesterday. I had left it there. I had not decided to leave it. I had simply not moved it. She began drawing. Cairo watched her draw. Then he watched me. He did this in alternation. Not, obviously, the way someone watched things when they had trained themselves to gather information without appearing to gather information. I was aware of it in the way I was aware of most things in my bakery, peripherally, accurately, without making it into something. After a while, he said, "How long have you been running this place?" 4 years, I said. He said, "Before that?" I said, "I apprenticed at a bakery across the city for 2 years. Before that, I worked 3 jobs while I was at school." He said, "What did you study?" I said, "Food science. I didn't finish." He said, "Why not?" I said, "The registration requirement changed in my 3rd year. I would have had to register as an omega to sit my final exams. I decided that wasn't going to happen." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "You've been unregistered since you were 20. I said, 21. I left school a semester early. He said, "That's a difficult way to live in this city." I said, "It's the way I chose. I keep my head down. I know my neighborhood. I know and who to avoid. I've been fine." He said, "Until Harrow." I looked at him. He said, "The Harrow Syndicate has been encroaching on the Western District for 2 months. They'll have surveillance on this street. An unregistered omega running a business here is the kind of leverage they look for." I said, "You've already run the threat assessment." He said, "Last night." "Yes." I said, "What did it tell you?" He said, "That you've been visible in this district for 4 years, and no one has moved against you, which means either you're well protected by the neighborhood network or you have something they want to keep available. Probably both." I said, "I feed people. People who are fed don't tend to burn down the kitchen." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, the structural element of one. He said, "That's an unusual strategy for self-protection." I said, "It's worked so far." He drank his coffee. He looked at Aaron, who was absorbed in a drawing that appeared to involve several wolves in a building with very large windows. He said, "She talked about us, the 3 days." I said, "She talked about all 3 of you, in considerable detail." He said, "What did she say about me?" I said, "She said you think a lot, that you look at things for a long time before you decide. She said you're the one who knows where everything is in the compound, down to which drawer the spare keys are in, which she finds useful because she can ask you and not have to look." A pause. He said, "She uses that more than I'd like." I said, "She seemed aware of that." He looked at his cup. He said, "She said you put socks on her feet." I said, "Her feet were cold." He said, "She mentioned it 4 times last night. The socks. She mentioned the bread, the drawings, the rabbit Jerome brought, and the socks, in that order, repeatedly." I did not say anything. He said, "She doesn't attach to people easily. She never has. Something about her temperament she observes for a long time before she decides." He paused. "She decided about you before she finished the first piece of bread." I looked at Aaron, who was adding detail to a wolf's ear with the green pen. I said, "She's an easy child to know." He said, "She's a particular child to know. Most people don't manage it." I went to check the oven. The second batch was ready. I brought the loaves out and set them to cool and did not look at Cairo while I thought about what he had just said and what it meant that he had said it. Romy came the following day. Alone also, no Aaron, which I had not expected. He sat at Aaron's stool, which felt both wrong and right. He was large enough that the stool looked provisional under him. He said nothing when I put coffee in front of him. He wrapped his hands around the cup and looked at the wall behind the register at the drawings. I waited. After a while, he said, "She drew all of these." I said, 3 days' worth. He looked at the wolf carrying the smaller wolf, which was still at the center where Fisher had touched it. He said, "She told me what the big one is." I said, "She told me too." He said, "She's never told me that before, that she thinks of me that way." His voice was even. The evenness of it cost him something. I could see the cost. I said, "She probably assumed you knew." He looked at me. I said, "She talks about you like someone who assumes the person she's talking about already understands what she means. She describes you as fact, not as someone she's trying to explain." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What else did she say?" I told him what she had told me. The scar, the shoe-tying lesson, and the large fingers. The way he spoke rarely, and meant it when he did. I told it the way she had told it, as fact, as description, the affectionate clarity of someone painting a person they knew completely. He listened to all of it without looking at me. He looked at the drawings. When I finished, he said, "She's all right." It was not a question. I said, "She's all right." He put his cup down. He stood. He went to the bakery door and stood looking at the hinge, which had been stiff since the autumn got cold, and which I had been meaning to address for 3 weeks. He said, "You have a screwdriver?" I said, "Under the counter, left drawer." He found it. He adjusted the hinge in approximately 90 seconds, tested the door, and put the screwdriver back. He said, "It'll do for now. I'll bring the right hardware next time." He left. I stood looking at the door, which now swung smoothly, and thought about what next time times meant when a Voss said it. Fisher came on the third day, in the evening, after the bakery had officially closed. He knocked and waited, which told me something about him that his brother's arrivals had not. I opened the door. He came in and sat at the counter. He had a tablet with him, which he set on the counter and did not open. He looked at the menu board, where Aaron's wolf was still in the corner. I made tea. I put it in front of him. He looked at it as if he had not expected it. He said, "You close at 6. I said, "You knocked." He said, "Most people would have told me to come back tomorrow." I said, "You came back. That's different from someone who hasn't been here yet." He looked at me. He said, "We're going to keep coming. I want you to know that's deliberate. It's not Aaron's schedule driving it, though Aaron's attachment to this place is real, and we're not going to disrupt it." He paused. "But the 3 of us coming here every other day is not only about Aaron." I leaned on the counter. I said, "I know." He said, "Does that bother you?" I said, "Not yet. I want to understand what it is before I decide how I feel about it." He opened the tablet. He turned it so I could see the screen. It showed a map of the Western District with several buildings marked. He said, "These are Harrow properties within 4 blocks of your bakery. They've been running low-level surveillance on this street since the compound incident. They know we've been here. I want you to understand the risk profile clearly." I looked at the map. I said, "You're telling me this directly." He said, "You said you wanted to understand what things are. This is part of what this is. You're connected to us now, through Aaron, through the visits. That connection has implications." I said, "I've been unregistered in this city for 6 years. I understand implications." He said, "This is different from unregistered. This is visible." I said, "I know." He said, "Does that change anything for you?" I thought about it honestly. I said, "No. But I want to know what you're going to do about it." He said, "We're going to resolve the Harrow situation." I said, "How long?" He said, 2 weeks, maybe 3. I said, "And in the meantime?" He said, "In the meantime, you're not alone in this district." He said it plainly, without theater, as information. I looked at the map again. Then, at Fisher, who was watching me with the same cold precision he had brought to the first meeting. Except that it was not cold anymore, it was simply precise. The temperature of someone who had learned to keep their feelings behind glass and was currently deciding whether the glass was necessary. I said, Erin told me you get her books about things she's interested in, that you explain things to her like she's going to understand all of it. He said, she usually does understand all of it. She's 4. I said, she noticed that you expect that from her. He said, is that a problem? I said, she thinks it's the best thing about you. He looked at the menu board, at the wolf in the corner. He said, after a moment, she told me the same thing about the socks. I said, what about the socks? He said, that you put socks on her feet when she came in, that it was the first thing you did after you asked if she was hungry. I said, her feet were cold. He said, she said, Fisher stopped. He picked up his tea and put it down again. She said it was the first time someone who wasn't us had taken care of her feet. That she has to wear specific shoes at the compound because of the floors, and you just found socks and put them on. I looked at him. He said, she talks about it the way she talks about the things that matter to her, specifically. I said, she's a particular person. He said, she is. He picked up the tea and drank it. He looked at the wall of drawings. He stayed for another hour, and we talked about ordinary things, the neighborhood, the bread, a book Erin had asked him to find for her that he hadn't been able to source yet, and when he left his jacket on the hook by the door. He did not appear to notice. I noticed. I left it there. The visits became a pattern. Not scheduled, not formalized, they came when they came, individually and occasionally together, and the bakery absorbed them with the same ease it absorbed everyone who came through the door with regularity. The counter learned their shapes. Cairo at the far right, Fisher in the middle, Romy wherever Erin was. Erin came every other day. She had an established routine counter stool, pen and paper, bread with seeds, a conversation about whatever she had been thinking about, drawing until one of her fathers arrived to take her home. She treated the bakery the way some children treated a grandparent's house, as a destination, a place with specific associations and specific comforts, and a specific person behind the counter who knew her order. I watched the 3 alphas in my space with the attention I brought to things I was trying to understand. Cairo asked questions. This was his mode. He gathered information the way other people gathered objects, with care and purpose and a clear sense of what he was building toward. He asked about the neighborhood, about the baking, about the years before the bakery. He asked in the way of someone who was genuinely interested rather than performing interest, which was a distinction I had learned to make early and relied on. I answered him. I asked questions in return. The conversations were the most symmetrical of the 3. We were both people who operated by understanding things clearly, and we had found an easy rhythm in it. Romy fixed things. He came the following Tuesday with the hardware he had promised and replaced the hinge properly, then looked at the display case, which had a loose panel on the left side, and fixed that too. The week after, he resealed the front window that had been letting in a cold draft since September. He did all of this without announcement, with the focused competence of someone for whom doing a thing correctly was its own sufficient reason for doing it. I stopped asking if he wanted coffee before he started a job because he always said yes, and I had started just having it ready. Fisher talked. He talked in the evenings, after closing, when he came without Erin and sat at the counter with his tablet and his tea and gradually put the tablet away. He talked about Erin, about who she was, about the texture of loving someone that precise and that young, about the mistakes they had made in the early years before they understood what she needed. He talked about the compound, about the legitimate business side of the Voss operation that he managed, about the specific exhaustion of holding a legal architecture over something that was not entirely legal and making sure the architecture held. He talked with the quality of someone who had been keeping things behind glass for a long time and had found, in the specific atmosphere of a bakery after closing hours, that the glass was not as necessary as he had thought. I listened. I responded. I gave him second cups of tea. The cedar and smoke scent was permanent in the bakery now. Not overwhelming present, the way a structural element was present, load-bearing without being visible. My Omega biology registered it and had registered it continuously since Erin had first walked through the door, and what it was doing now was more specific than secondary attachment. It was the specific warmth of repeated proximity, the biological acknowledgement of, here, These, consistently. I managed this with the competence I brought to everything. But I noted it. I noted it clearly and without dismissing it, because dismissing accurate information was not how I operated. What I was deciding was what to do with it. On the 8th, visit Cairo and Fisher together, a Saturday afternoon. Aaron drawing at the far end of the counter. The afternoon light was doing what it did in autumn in this city, coming in low and gold through the west-facing window, turning everything warm. Erin had moved from her usual stool to the floor under the window, where the light was better, and was drawing on the back of a paper bag with her collection of pens spread around her. I was taking the last loaves out of the oven. Erin had been asleep for half an hour when I noticed, and I had been carrying her more or less continuously since she had tipped sideways on the floor, her and the paper bag drawing she had been holding, which I had folded carefully and tucked into my apron pocket, and I was doing the thing I did without thinking, the thing I had learned in 3 days of her being here. I adjusted her weight. I made sure her head was supported, and I carried her upstairs to the daybed. I laid her down. I got the spare blanket. I came back downstairs. All three of them, Romy had come in during the hour, quietly, and I had registered his arrival without stopping what I was doing, were looking at the doorway I had just come through. The expression on all three faces was the same expression with 3 different qualities to it. Cairo had the look of a man receiving information he was processing very carefully. Fisher had the look of a man who had been expecting something and was now watching it arrive. Romy had the look of a man who had made a decision about something and was at peace with it. I went back behind the counter. Fisher said, "She's never let anyone but us carry her." I said, "She was asleep." Romy said, "She would have woken up if it was someone she didn't want." I looked at him. He said, "She wakes when people she doesn't know touch her, since she was small." He paused. "She didn't wake." I looked at the 3 of them. I said, "She's an easy child to trust." None of them argued with this. The afternoon held the quality of something that had arrived and settled and was not going to be the same after as it had been before. I made bread. They stayed. The cedar and smoke scent, and the warmth of the oven, and the particular quality of late afternoon light in autumn made the bakery into a space that I was going to have to make a decision about, and I was aware of this, and I was still deciding. Erin woke when the light was going. She came downstairs with the paper bag drawing in her hand and climbed onto the stool and looked at me. She said, "I fell asleep." I said, "You did." She said, "Did you carry me?" I said, "You were on the floor." She considered this. She said, "Okay." She spread the paper bag drawing on the counter to smooth it. It was the most detailed thing she had done yet, all 4 of them, rendered in her careful architectural lines, 3 tall figures and 1 medium one, in a building that had a counter in it, and on the counter, bread. She looked at it. She said, "That's here." I said, "I can see that." She said, "You're the medium one. The tall ones are my dad's." I said, "I know which one I am." She said, "You're all in the same place." I said, "Yes." She picked up the green pen and added detail to the bread on the counter. She gave it seeds. Behind me, I heard Fisher make a sound that was very quiet and that he immediately controlled. They came on a Thursday morning. I was alone. The triplets were not due until the afternoon. Aaron was at the compound and the bakery was in the middle of the morning service when 2 men came in and bought coffee and sat at the counter. They were professional about it. That was the thing I noticed first. No overt aggression, no raised voices, nothing that would read as threatening to the other 2 customers who were sitting at the window table. They bought their coffee. They sat. The larger of the 2 said pleasantly that it was nice to see a small business doing well in this district, that it would be a shame about the zoning concerns he had heard were circulating, that an unregistered Omega running a food business was the kind of thing that attracted official attention if the right people made the right calls. He said all of this with the tone of someone expressing mild concern. His companion said nothing. He did not need to. He was there as a size argument. I listened to all of it. The 2 other customers left. They had picked up on something in the room, the way people picked up on things, and they left quietly, and then it was just me and the 2 men. The larger one set a card on the counter. He said that sometimes businesses in this district found it useful to reduce their exposure to certain associations, that it was nothing personal. I said, "I appreciate you stopping by." I said it pleasantly. They left. I stood at the counter for approximately 30 seconds. Then I picked up my phone and called Cairo. He answered in one ring. I said, 2 men from Harrow just came into my bakery. I'm going to tell you what they said in the order they said it. I told him. Plainly, in sequence, without editorializing. The silence, when I finished, lasted 4 seconds. He said, Is Erin there? I said, No, she's with you. He said, Are you alone now? I said, Yes. He said, Stay inside. Don't open for the afternoon. We'll be there within the hour. I said, I'll have dinner on. A pause. A different kind of pause from the ones he usually gave me, shorter, less calculated, more immediate. He said, You're very calm. I said, I've been unregistered in this city for 6 years. This isn't the first time someone has tried to use that against me. But I don't usually have a 4-year-old in the building when it happens, and that changes the math. Erin needs to know this address is safe. He said, She will. I said, I know. That's why I called you. He said, Rudy. I waited. He said, You called me because of Erin. I said, I called you because of Erin, and because you should know your rivals are aware of this location. Both things are true. Another pause. He said, We'll be there. They arrived in 50 minutes. All 3 of them. The security apparatus settled into the street outside with the quiet efficiency of an organization that had been doing this for years. Romy came through the door first and went to the back of the bakery without asking, checked the rear exit, came back. Fisher was already on his tablet at the counter, pulling up information I could not see the details of, but that made his expression go flat and focused. Cairo stood near the door and looked at me. He said, Tell me again. I told him again. He listened with the total stillness of someone for whom listening was a professional skill. When I finished, he said, The card? I handed it to him. He looked at it briefly, passed it to Fisher without comment. Fisher said, without looking up from the tablet, Harrow has had surveillance on this street since the compound incident, 2 properties within 3 blocks. They've been building a file on the Omega businesses in the Western District as potential pressure points. He looked at me when he said, Times Omega businesses. I said, How many? He said, 4. Yours is the one with the most obvious connection to us. I said, Because of the visits. He said, Yes. I said, I assumed that was a risk when you kept coming. Cairo said, We assessed it. I said, and decided to keep coming anyway. He said, Yes. I said, What was the assessment? He looked at me steadily. He said, That the risk to you from Harrow's attention was lower than the risk to Erin from losing access to this place, and that we were not willing to lose access either. The bakery was quiet. The afternoon light came in at the low gold angle it always came in at this time of year. Romy was leaning against the wall near the back, arms crossed, watching the street through the window. Fisher was working. Cairo was looking at me. I said, You factored me into a security assessment. He said, Yes. I said, As something to protect. He said, As someone we are not willing to lose. I held his gaze. He did not look away from it, which was the most honest thing he could have done. Later, after the security arrangements had been made and Fisher had closed the tablet and Romy had made a circuit of the building that I had not asked for and was quietly grateful for, the 4 of us sat at the small table near the back with the dinner I had made. Bread and a thick soup from the root vegetables I had been keeping in the cold store, because that was what I had and that was what the evening required. The table was designed for 2 people. It held 4 inadequately. Nobody suggested moving. Romy ate 2 bowls without speaking. Fisher ate 1 bowl and kept his eyes on his phone but put it away when I refilled his. Cairo ate steadily and looked at me between bites, with the expression of a man who had been building towards something for weeks and was deciding how to arrive at it. I said, There's something I want to say. The table went quiet. Even Romy, who was not a man who quieted easily, stilled. I said, You've been coming here every other day for 3 weeks. Individually, together, with Erin, without her. I know what the official reason is. Erin is attached to this place and you're not going to disrupt that attachment. I looked at each of them. I said, But that's not the only reason anymore, and I think all 4 of us know that. and I need to say plainly that I'm not going to be something that happens to you because your daughter likes me. I'm not going to be a convenience or a surrounding circumstance. If this is something real, then it needs to be said directly. The quiet in the room had a texture to it. Fisher said, "It's real." He said it without hesitation, the same way he said things that were facts. Romy put his hand flat on the table, not toward me, just flat, present, the gesture of a man who expressed himself through being physically present rather than through words. Cairo looked at me for a long moment. He was the strategist, the one who looked at things before deciding, the one Aaron had described with the specific fondness of a child who found her father's careful attention reassuring rather than frustrating. He said, "I have been watching you for 3 weeks. I do this with everything I want to understand." He paused. "I understand you. I know the way you move in this space, the way you think about the neighborhood, the way you handled today. I know you called me because of Aaron, and I know you also called me because it was the right call, and you knew I would want to know." He said, "I've been working toward saying this for a week. I'm not naturally fast at this kind of thing." I said, "I know. Aaron told me." The corner of his mouth moved. He said, "What I want to say is that I am certain about this. That's not a common state for me. I assess things, and I arrive at probabilities. This is not a probability." He looked at his hands, then back at me. "This is certain." I looked at the three of them, at the table that was too small and that no one had suggested replacing with something larger, at the soup bowls and the bread and the low warm light of the bakery after hours. I said, "Then we go slowly. I decide the pace, and you respect that." Cairo said, "Yes." Romy said, "Yes." Fisher said, "Yes. Then, all three of us?" I said, "All three of you, or none of it? I'm not going to do this in parts." He looked at me. He said, "All three of us." I nodded. I picked up my spoon. I said, "Finish your soup." They finished their soup. The Harrow situation resolved in 11 days. I did not ask what form the resolution took. I did not need to know. What I needed to know was that 2 men did not come back to my bakery, that the surveillance on my street ended, and that Fisher told me, on a Tuesday evening, that the Harrow Syndicate had reached an understanding with the Voss organization regarding the Western District. I said, "What kind of understanding?" He said, "The permanent kind." I said, "Okay." I gave him more tea. What followed was not a dramatic beginning. It was the continuation of what had already been building, with the difference that it was now named and therefore could be built deliberately instead of by accumulation. The bakery was still mine. This was not a question, and nobody made it one. The compound was still theirs. Erin spent most of her time there, and the 3 of them ran their various operations from it. And the structure of their lives was not dismantled for the purpose of fitting into my ground floor flat above a bakery in the Western District. What happened instead was a gradual and specific infiltration. Romy came on Tuesdays and fixed things. This had been true before and was more true after. He worked through the bakery's accumulated maintenance needs with the focused, systematic competence of a man who expressed care through function. He replaced the display case panel. He resealed the windows before winter. He repaired the cold store latch that had been giving me trouble since spring. One Tuesday, he arrived with 2 of his people and spent 4 hours installing something in the building's walls that Fisher later explained was a security system, which I had not asked for, and which I checked over carefully and accepted on the basis that it did what Fisher said it did and nothing else. I made him coffee every Tuesday. He drank it. Fisher came in the evenings. He had always come in the evenings, but there was a difference now in how he came. The tablets stayed in his bag more often, or came out only briefly, and the conversations were less about the Western District threat profile and more about Aaron, about the work, about the specific texture of ordinary things. He talked differently than he had in the beginning. The glass was down, not because he had stopped being careful, Fisher was always careful, but because he had decided that careful and present were not mutually exclusive and had started practicing both simultaneously. His jacket on the hook by the door had become a given. I had put a second hook there without announcement. He had noticed and said nothing. This was, I had come to understand, the Fisher-Voss form of acknowledgement. Cairo came with Aaron on Saturdays and sometimes other days. He had started coming to the morning market. This had not been proposed, he had simply appeared one Saturday morning at the market stalls I always visited, slightly out of place in the way of someone in a very good coat who was genuinely trying to understand what he was looking at rather than performing interest in it. He asked good questions. He was learning what to look for. He sent me a message 2 weeks in that said, "The seedsman on the north side has a winter variety I think you'd want. Second stall from the left." I went and looked. He was right. I sent back, "Good eye." He sent back, after a pause, "You're teaching me what to look for." I sat with that for a moment. I sent, "You've been learning since the first time you asked a question. I just answer them." He did not respond immediately. Then, "That's what I mean." Erin came every other day, sometimes more. She had a table in the back room now, a small one I had found at the second-hand market, the right height for a 4-year-old, with 2 chairs, one of which was almost never occupied by anyone but her. She did her drawing there and her homework when she started it, and sometimes she just sat with books while I worked in the kitchen, the ambient company of a child who had decided that a bakery was where she did her best thinking. The wall behind the register had run out of space. I had started putting her drawings on the opposite wall, then along the window ledge. Then I bought a second corkboard which Fisher installed without being asked while I was doing the morning prep, which was very Fisher. Erin looked at the second corkboard when she came in that afternoon and said, "Good. I have more to put on it." She did. One afternoon she came in with a book she had apparently carried from the compound under her arm, large, heavy, illustrated. She put it on her backroom table and opened it to a page she had marked with a folded napkin. She said, "This is the pack hierarchy diagram." She pointed to a page that showed a family structure in Omegaverse biology, the kind of thing that was in academic texts and children's educational books both, the structure of how a pack formed and what it meant. I looked at the diagram. She said, "This is what we are, isn't it?" I said, "What do you think?" She said, "I think yes." She pointed to the center of the diagram where the omega was indicated. "That's you." She pointed to the 3 positions surrounding it. "Those are my dad's." She pointed to a smaller position at the edge. "And this is where the pup goes." She looked at the diagram. She said, "I'm the pup." I said, "In the diagram?" She said, "In real life, too." I looked at her. She said, "I decided when you put socks on my feet." She said it with the same quality she used for all facts she considered settled, that you were ours. She looked at the diagram again. "I just didn't say it out loud until now." I said, "Are you going to say it out loud to your dads?" She said, "I already did, last week." She picked up a pen. Cairo said I was right. Romy didn't say anything, but he went and fixed your display case the next morning, which is the same as saying it. Fisher said he'd been thinking the same thing since the jacket. I said, "The jacket." She said, "He leaves his jacket here on purpose," he told me. He said it started as an accident, and then it stopped being an accident. I looked at the hook by the door where Fisher's jacket was currently hanging. I said, "Erin." She looked up. I said, "Are you happy?" She thought about this with the seriousness she brought to questions that deserved it. She said, "I was happy at the compound. But here, I'm happy in a different way." She put the pen to paper, like when you have something and then you have more of it. Not, instead, more. She began drawing. I went back to the bread. The first time all 3 of them arrived at the bakery simultaneously without Erin, it was unplanned. Fisher had come early, Romy had come late, Cairo had arrived in between, and I had looked up from behind the counter to find all 3 of them in the small bakery at once. And the cedar and smoke scent had filled the room the way a weather system filled a space, not overwhelming, just completely present, the total inhabitation of a place by something that belonged in it. I looked at the 3 of them. I put 3 cups of coffee on the counter. I said, "Sit down. I'm making something." They sat down. I made bread. Not the morning loaves, something different, something that took time and attention and required me to be at the bench working while the 3 of them were at the counter in the space that had become, in the months since a 4-year-old arrived barefoot on my step, the warmest place I had ever inhabited. The table near the back was too small for 4 people. We ate there anyway. The bread was good, Cairo said so directly, which he did with things he meant. Romy ate 2 pieces and did not say anything, which was also a form of saying so. Fisher held his peace for a moment before eating it, the way he held things he was paying attention to. The bond recognition had been building since Aaron first brought the scent through my door, my omega biology and their alpha biology, doing the thing that biology did in the presence of proximity and safety and repeated choice. And it had been present in the room since the first visit, accumulating in the background, patient, not demanding anything of me until I was ready to let it. It did not arrive as a declaration. It arrived as bread and coffee and a table that was too small and nobody suggesting a larger one. The specific biological warmth of here, this, these, home. I did not mark anyone. That was not this moment. This moment was ordinary, which was exactly what it was supposed to be. This was what it felt like when the right thing was also the simple thing. When the answer to the question of what you wanted had been sitting at your counter since a Tuesday in early autumn when a small girl appeared on your step following the smell of bread and you opened the door because that was the only thing you knew how to do. I gave Cairo more coffee. He looked at me and said, with the specific quality he had for things he had thought about carefully and was now stating as settled, I've been coming here every week for 3 months, and I have not wanted to be anywhere else on any of those days. I said, I know. He said, that's not something I say easily. I said, I know that too. He picked up the coffee. He said, quieter, Aaron was right, about the socks. I said, she usually is. He said she knew before she finished the first piece of bread. I said, I knew around the same time. He said, what did you know? I said, that whatever came through that door with her was going to matter. I didn't know what shape it would take. I just knew it was going to matter. He held my gaze. He said, it does. Romy put his hand on the table between us, flat, present, the same gesture he had made on the night I told them what I needed. Not reaching. Just there. I put my hand beside his. Fisher looked at the window. Outside the bakery, the city was doing what it did, persistent, indifferent, loud. Inside, the bread was warm and the coffee was good and 3 alpha cents and 1 omega cent were occupying a small table that was not big enough and that nobody was going to replace because the smallness was the point. The smallness meant staying close. The smallness meant choosing to stay. We stayed. Spring came to the Western District the way it always did, reluctantly, then all at once, the cold backing off degree by degree until one morning you opened the bakery door and the air smelled different, like the city had turned over in its sleep and found a more comfortable position. I opened the door at 5:30 and stood in it for a moment, breathing the changed air. Aaron came in at 8:30, earlier than usual, carrying the Wolf book under one arm and a new notebook under the other. She had grown since autumn, she was taller now, her hair longer, and she wore a small jacket that had a pocket on the front where she kept her favorite pen. She climbed onto her stool, set the book and notebook on the counter, and looked at me with the dark, watchful eyes that had been the first thing I had seen of her. She said, the seeded bread. I said, it's cooling. She nodded. She opened the notebook and began drawing. The morning moved through its rhythms. The regular customers came and went. The loaves came out of the oven in sequence. I heard Romy before I saw him. He was on the phone outside, his voice audible through the window in the carrying way his voice had. And then the door opened, and he came in and sat at the end of the counter. He looked at Aaron. He looked at me. He picked up the coffee I had put at his place and drank it. He said to Aaron, what are you drawing? She turned the notebook so he could see. It was all of them. The bakery in the center of the page, drawn in her careful architectural lines, rendered with the proportions she had been developing since autumn, accurate, detailed. A small building that looked exactly like itself. Inside the bakery, visible through the windows, 4 figures. Outside the bakery, visible on the step, smaller shapes that were either wolves or a child or both. She said, it's us. He said, I can see. She turned the notebook back and added detail to the step. Romy looked at the drawing for another moment, then looked at me. He said, Fisher's coming tonight, bringing the wood for the backroom table. I said, the one Aaron designed? He said, she changed the dimensions again. He said it with the resigned affection of a man who had learned that a specific 4-year-old's design changes were not optional. Fisher said, "It's the 4th revision." I said, "She's been thinking about the proportions." He said, "She has strong opinions about proportions." I said, "She has strong opinions about everything." He said, "Yes." He finished his coffee. He went to the back and started on something with the pipes under the cold store that had been making a sound I had been trying to diagnose for 2 weeks and that he had apparently also been thinking about. I heard Cairo before I saw him too, not a voice this time, but the quality of a presence arriving in the street outside, the particular way the cedar and smoke scent shifted when its source was within range. He came through the door at mid-morning, slightly later than usual, and set a small paper bag on the counter before sitting down. He said, "The seedsman on the north side had the new summer variety in. I thought you'd want to look." I opened the bag. Seeds I hadn't seen before, a variety I had been trying to source since winter. I said, "How did you know he had them?" He said, "I stop there on Tuesdays now. He knows what you're looking for." I looked at him. He said, evenly, "You taught me what to look for." I kept looking. I put the seeds in the tin where I kept the specialty ingredients. I said, "Thank you." He said, "The bread with these will be good." I said, "It will." He sat with his coffee and looked at Erin, who had moved her drawing operation to the backroom table and was currently visible through the door, head bent over the notebook, pen moving. He said, "She showed me the drawing this morning, before she came." I said, "The one she's working on now?" He said, "A version of it. She changes things between the compound and here." I said, "What does she change?" He said, "The number of figures outside on the step." He looked at the door where Erin was drawing. She started with one small shape on the step. This morning, it was 2. I said, "What does she say about it?" He said, "She says she's still deciding." He picked up his coffee. She said she'll know when she draws it right. The bakery was warm. The spring air came through the propped door in small quantities, carrying the smell of the changed season. Inside, the bread was good, the coffee was good, the cedar and smoke scent was present and settled and home in the way of things that had been in a place long enough to belong to it. I was still deciding some things. This was accurate. There were things in the architecture of us that were still being drawn, still being revised, still finding their correct proportions. The marking had not happened yet. The formal claiming had not happened. These were things that took time, and I set the pace, and all 3 of them understood this and respected it. But the bond was there. It had been there since a 4-year-old brought it through my door on a cold autumn morning, carrying in the cedar and smoke of her father's scent and standing on my step with bare feet and a question in her eyes that was not really a question because she had already decided. She had decided before she finished the first piece of bread. I had known it was going to matter around the same time. Both things were true, and both things had been true for 6 months, and both things would keep being true for all the time that came after. That afternoon, Erin brought her notebook out from the back room and set it on the counter. She turned it to the current drawing and looked at it for a long time. She picked up the green pen. She drew a second small shape on the step beside the first, then looked at what she had made. She nodded once, the nod of a person who has arrived at the correct answer. She showed it to me. The bakery in the center, careful and accurate, the 4 figures inside, visible through the windows, and on the step, outside the door, 2 small shapes with ears, sitting together, looking in. She said, "That's right now." I looked at the drawing. I said, "What are the 2 outside?" She said, "The ones who are still deciding." I said, "Who are they?" She looked at me with the patient expression of someone explaining something obvious to someone she loved. She said, "You and me." I held the drawing. She said, "But we're on the step, not in the street." She pointed. "See, we're right there." She tapped the door. The door's open. She took the pen back and added one more detail, a small mark on the step below the 2 shapes, something between them, something small. She said, "That's a crumb from the bread." I looked at the crumb on the step. She said, "You always leave the door open in the morning, and you always leave crumbs." She said it the way she said all the things she had decided were true about a person, as fact, as something she had observed and kept. She said, "That's how I found you." I looked at this 4-year-old who had walked for 2 hours through a city following the smell of bread and changed everything. I said, "Yes, that's how you found me." She put the notebook on the wall beside the register, below the first wolf drawing, the one from the morning she arrived. She said, "That one stays, for always." I said, "For always." She climbed down from the stool and went back to the table in the back room. I looked at the drawing on the wall, the bakery in the center, the 4 figures inside, the 2 small shapes on the step, in the light from the open door, with a crumb between them and the whole warm interior visible through the glass. The door open, the bread already made.